everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see a really strong turnout for an event like this. I'm really excited to be hosting actually just two personal friends of mine today, which is how I decided to make this event happen. I realized I know both these guys and they know each other. Let's do a book talk. My name is Riana Pfefferkorn. I'm a policy fellow here at Stanford High. And I am also like reading both fiction and nonfiction books in my copious spare time. And so I'm very pleased to have with us today Adam Becker, who is immediately to my right, and Jon Evans, who is to his right. Adam is a science journalist and an astrophysicist whose first book, What is Real, was about the history of quantum physics. His most recent book, published last spring by Basic Books, is More Everything Forever, AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. Next to him is Jon Evans. Jon is an author and engineer who has also spent time as a journalist, CTO, startup founder, archivist, and semi-pro traveler. His most recent novel is Exadelic, published by Tor Books, about an AI that learns to hack reality itself and promptly decides an obscure and very confused Silicon Valley middle manager is the primary threat to its existence. He has also written at length about modern AI's strange roots in unusual and unusually colorful Bay Area subcultures. After we have our discussion, we will have some time for Q&A. And after that, we will have an opportunity for a book signing. We have books for sale over there through the Stanford bookstore. Thanks to the bookstore for helping us out there. So let's get started. Just to get started, I'll ask each of you if you could just tell us about your book, what motivated you to write it, and how have the reactions been to the book so far? And we'll start with you.
I guess the short answer to what motivated me to write it is I've lived in the Bay.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. I've been here for, almost 15 years now. And when I decided to start writing the book, I've been here for almost a decade. And had met a lot of people at a lot of parties who believed a lot of strange things that didn't make much sense to me. And I was seeing those ideas sort of filter out into the wider culture and seeing people take Silicon Valley billionaires and leaders of Silicon Valley subcultures as authorities on science and technology, even when they had no background in either. And that seemed like a problem. I didn't realize how large a problem it was. But here we are. So yeah, that's what motivated me to write the book, and I don't know.
Well, as an initial matter, maybe so you're an astrophysicist,
yeah.
Freelance astrophysicist, as your own domain name goes. You switched from quantum physics. How did you prepare for writing a book that was so unlike doing science journalism and just the easy lift of astrophysics?
Yes. Astrophysics, the easiest lift there is. I mean, when I was in the middle of writing my first book, Trump got elected first. And I decided that if I had a chance to write another book, it would be something more directly politically relevant. Because I think, maybe this is controversial. I think fascism is bad. How did I prepare to do it? Mostly blind confidence and then sheer panic. I went into it thinking that this might be something I could do if I did a lot of work, and then thought, oh, wait, I'm not a tech journalist, I'm a science journalist. Why did I think I could do this? This seems like a job for a tech journalist. And eventually what became clear to me as I got deeper in was that the techniques of science journalism, especially critical science journalism, not just, cheerleading for science, but actually taking a critical look at what people are doing in science is actually the right toolkit for doing. Because a lot, I'm not going to say all, but a lot of tech journalism is access journalism, where journalists will trade their ability to critique their subjects away in order to gain access to the wealthy and the powerful. I didn't have any such issue. If a tech journalist who acts in that way, engages in access journalism, loses access, they lose their ability to do their job. I don't have any such problem. And so it didn't matter if I criticize these people, I could just say what I wanted. And yeah, that means that a lot of people didn't want to talk to me. So I listed the people who didn't want to talk to me and put them at the back of the book.
It's a great list. It's like, here's what this person did. Like, did they not respond? Did they ghost me after I flew all the way across the ocean to go with them?
That did seem a little egregious. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, that was a professor of ethics.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing anybody does is to flip to the index of a book and find out, like, am I in there? And then if you find yourself, you might find yourself unflatteringly listed, maybe compared to how you expected to go. So how has the reaction been so far to the book? It seems like you started writing this and anticipated like the zeitgeist that has since seized not just Silicon Valley, but kind of the broader world.
To some extent, yes. I didn't, like I said, I didn't think it would go quite this bad. Or this bad.
For the book, or
It's been going very well.
Inverse relationship.
Yes, exactly. Yes. No, I really thought that I was going to have to spend more time after the book came out trying to convince people, hey, these guys really don't have your best interests in mind. They don't know what they're talking about. The thing happened between submitting the book in summer of 2024 and having the book come out last spring. But the reception has been almost uniformly positive, which has been a nice surprise, mostly because I think these tech oligarchs can't read. And so they haven't paid any attention to it. I got in a fight with one of them on Blue Sky, at which point he said I wasn't taking him seriously, and so he wasn't going to read my book unless I showed that I was willing to take his ideas seriously. And I said I didn't. He said, like,
other people are reading it, and it seems like it's connecting with an audience.
I think so. Seems like that.
Jon, you are historically more of a thriller novelist with also good techno thrillers, often set, Silicon Valley or Silicon Valley adjacent, often featuring, as it might happen, some guy who works in tech who sounds kind of a lot like you. And then a switch with a brief detour into a book about squirrels to writing Exadelic. Can you tell us where'd that come from? You yourself, having been a tech journalist as well as quite a lot of other things, it seems like they may have informed the book.
I too have lived in the Bay Area too long, roughly as long as Adam actually. But also science fiction was like my first literary love growing up. And so I always wanted to write a big, sweeping everything and the kitchen sink science fiction novel, which is what this wound up being. It starts as a techno thriller, just I guess to trick my previous readership into a false sense of security. The basic premise is that this mild-mannered, hapless present-day protagonist finds to his considerable surprise that someone has developed a super intelligent AI, and then to his great dismay that for no apparent reason it has decided that he personally is the biggest threat to its existence. Complications ensue and extend from there to 1,000 years in the future and several thousand years in the past and various colorful points in between. Again, it's kind of all the science fiction. There's time travel, there are aliens, there's space travel, there are parallel dimensions. But fundamentally, it's mostly about AI and the simulation theory, the notion that our universe is, software running on some Uber computer in some high reality somewhere. This seems like a good time to caveat that I do not think that we live in a simulation. Yes. But I do think it makes for a surprisingly good metaphor for the world in which we do live. I mean, last I checked, people spend an average of 7 hours a day looking at their screens. Like the way we understand the world, what we learn about the world, increasingly how we interact with the world, that world isn't software, but it's mediated by software to a shockingly large and increasing degree. And in fact, people live in different simulations. You can jump between realities. If you look at a left-wing political discussion site and a right-wing political discussion site, you have jumped from one world to another. They do not share the same facts. There are different realities that these people exist in, to our great dismay and wailing and gnashing of teeth, of course. And I wanted to write about that. I don't like didactic fiction. I don't like didactic metaphors. There's this cliche that science fiction is never about the future. It's really about the present. I reject that. My science fiction is about the future. But I do think there should be resonance with the present. I think a lot of the sort of chewy and interesting thinking that you can get from reading science fiction comes from that resonance to the present day and sort of extending it out. Rattling through the answers to your other questions, how people have reacted. Among people who like it, there has been a weird unanimity that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Almost everyone uses the phrase wild ride, which I'll take it, I guess. Thoughtful wild ride, maybe. People who don't like it, again, there's a lot of collective consensus there, which is sort of, this is too much. What is even going on, and why are there printing errors in my copy? There aren't actually printing errors. They just look like printing errors. I realize that's kind of a tough sell to many readers. And as for why I wrote it, I don't really have to get into that. I never do with my fiction. The real reason I write fiction is a voice in my head says, go and write this. And I'm like, sir, yes, sir. And a few months later, I look up and say, why am I doing this? And go back to work. And that's more or less my process. But I do think retroactively, I had this very weird gig just before I started writing Exadelic. I was directing the GitHub archive program, which pretty much printed out the world's open source software and stuck it in a cave beneath an Arctic mountain, as one does, terabytes and terabytes of it. We also did much more traditional archival work with various partners and so forth, but the Arctic mountain in Svalbard was the most sort of cinematic part. And the film we were printing it on was good for 1,000 years. And this led to sort of professional ruminations on like, 1,000 years is a very long time. You know, Angkor Wat, which was a forgotten ruin until relatively recently, had not even begun to exist 1,000 years ago. So, you know, if you start thinking about what humanity is going to be like 1,000 years from now, and even weirder, what software might be like, if there is such a thing as software 1,000 years from now, you go to some fairly colorful places. I circulated some essays around GitHub and Microsoft that I think were met with blank stares most of the time. And I think those kind of fed into the book that I wound up writing.
So you mentioned that, you know, you're thinking both about, you know, the next millennium of humanity and also software, what that might look like. And then I feel, Adam, this is kind of what a major theme of your book is, that there is a relatively widespread belief among certain communities, especially here in the Bay Area, that those two things will rise and converge, that we will all become software in some next version of humanity, which requires, I think, taking like a little bit of a step back. And maybe I could just see a show of hands here. Who's familiar with the acronym TESCREAL? Couple of people. Okay, the underlying components of TESCREAL are transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism as an overlapping and interconnected group of what some might call philosophy, others might call belief systems, so others might call cults. It's a term coined by Timnit Gebru, who is one of the many more skeptical voices on AI that you quote or interview for your book, many of whom have been derided, marginalized, let go from their jobs. Not coincidentally, a lot of them happen to be female and women of color, unlike the folks up here today. But that nevertheless, I think we're sounding an alarm that I think you have amply documented and pulled together a lot of those threads around kind of the dangers to the present day of some of these origin story communities, which, John, you documented very cogently a few years ago, around 2022, in a series of Substacks, also talking about some of the origins of these communities and the ways that some of them went a little bit pear-shaped. So I guess maybe I'll start with, if Adam, if you could do sort of like really like 10,000 foot view of some of these communities, what are their major belief systems, where they come from. Harry Potter fanfic is involved. And then maybe, John, like, could you tell us a little bit about how some of those have played out, maybe less optimally than their adherents might wish us to see them in public? Just summarize your whole book.
Yeah, exactly.
Summarize the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to start by saying I don't actually love the acronym. Not to diminish the contributions that Timnit and Neil, who wrote that first paper on TESCREAL, I think that it's a paper, but just speaking as someone who tries to write for a wide audience, I think that it's not a great acronym, and partly because, every single part of that acronym is itself a piece of jargon. be explained. So in my book, I took a stab at coming up with a different term for it, although I didn't see that paper until I was part of the way through writing the book, because I've been working on the book for quite a while. But I call it the ideology of technological salvation, which I think does maybe not a perfect name, but does a good job of explaining what's going on, the unifying theme behind all of these ideologies and other ideologies that are not like mentioned in that's real acronym. But basically, these are groups of people who believe that the future of technology is inevitable, or at least, just has one or two or three possible outcomes. And that technology is the solution to all problems, and that a future in which we all go to space and live forever, either inside of or watched over by a machine god, is both possible and desirable. Now, there are other beliefs about the future that come along for the ride. There are some of these groups believe that because that's possible, there's also a possible future that involves a godlike machine killing everybody and destroying the solar system. And usually that's sort of played as, okay, either it's going to be that, it's going to be this paradise, and there's not much in between. I wrote a whole book on this. I'm not going to.
You can buy the book right over there. Yeah.
All I will say is there are the arguments given in favor of those positions are bad. The people who promote those arguments should feel bad, and there are good arguments that none of that works, and it's all hot nonsense.
But it seems like the people who are following some of these ideologies, or are convinced that we can in fact build data centers in space, just to give you another aneurysm, are also have the ear, as it turns out, of like CEOs, the vice presidents. So we have these, what you might even say dangerous, like ideologies that on their own, were they, I think when you covered them, maybe Jon, it was a little more like, here's an interesting fringe set of communities, but that are gaining a lot of influence within Silicon Valley, and concomitantly, thanks to like merger between like corporation and state, especially in the AI field right now in modern politics, having a lot more influence than I think maybe people starting a mailing list back in the 1990s to talk about transhumanism might have expected would have done.
Yeah. I want to give Jon something.
Yeah, absolutely. You wrote about you want to tell us about the mailing list and how we're all living in hell because of it.
Actually, let me briefly go back a little further, just for like extra color. This the sort of transhumanist urge and the simulationist urge seems to be like kind of hardwired in, or at least culturally wired in. You can go back a couple of thousand years. There was a early Christian saint, Saint Irenaeus of Smyrna, who believed that we would achieve salvation not through coming closer to God, but by becoming gods ourselves, eventually transhumanism. And there is a weird sort of shadow fringe Christianity called the Gnostics, which, to vastly oversimplify, believed that we lived in a simulation created by an artificial intelligence. I realize that sounds insane, but it's actually pretty close to, a word for word translation. And you could draw a direct line from the Gnostics through the author Philip K. Dick to the Matrix to envisionings of AI today. So there's a long, long backstory here.
I'm going to interrupt you briefly to plug a book by someone who's not here. There's a wonderful book called God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Giblin that does a great job of talking about all of this, and is also just beautifully written. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So in the mid 1990s, there was a mailing list, which also had sort of concomitant, real world experiences and houses and parties and conventions, called the Extropians, which had maybe 1,000 people. It grew over time, but a relatively small hardcore crew to talk about things like nanotechnology and becoming a sort of machine god yourself, and the encroaching singularity of notion coined by Jonathan Newman, the great physicist, mathematician really, and popularized by Werner Vinge, the computer science professor, science fiction writer. And It was, if you go back and read the archives, which I have done more than probably anyone else over the last few years, at least for a period in 2022, it's hugely entertaining. And these are by and large, good faith, well-meaning people, some sort of crazed libertarian stuff, but mostly actually pretty, like, they knew that they were talking extremely extrapolative, unlikely stuff, and they're sort of having fun with it. But as time went on, a few of them, and in particular, one particular autodidact named Eliezer Yudkowsky, and another autodidact named Nick Bostrom over in Europe, curiously, neither of whom went to high school, for varying reasons, but entirely self-taught.
Bostrom did get a PhD.
He did, yes, yeah. I guess not entirely. They began taking this more seriously at an event. They wound up getting Yudkowsky wound up getting funding for an institution to study artificial intelligence. A couple years later, he got connected to Peter Thiel, who was convinced that Yudkowsky was an interesting and extraordinary guy, which is true, by the way. Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his beliefs or what he did subsequently, in about 2003, on a mailing list that maybe a couple hundred other people read, Yudkowsky said, well, it's my mission to save the world through or from AI. He wasn't quite sure at that stage. But I think I may not be able to save the world entirely single-handedly. So I'm going to write a book, and that book will attract the people that we need to save the world, and that will turn into a movement, and that will succeed. And then, astonishingly, he went ahead and did that. He created an entire subculture and community, the rationalists, by posting on the internet and writing Harry Potter fan fiction over the next 5 years. Like, it is a staggering accomplishment that we will probably never see again. The direction of this group is questionable. A large number of cult-like entities sprung up around it, and the after effects of that exist to this day. But the fact that from a mailing list to one guy posting on the internet and writing Harry Potter fan fiction turned into, or at least intertwined with, rationalism, effective altruism, modern AI, and became like a very significant cultural force is just bizarre and stunning.
I don't disagree with anything that you said, except I do want to add that it's perhaps a little bit less unusual than you might think, given that, I agree that many cults and cult-like objects have spun out of the rationalists. That's, not terribly surprising, given that the rationalists themselves are either a cult or a cult-like object. And, posting your way into creating a cult is unusual, but not unheard of.
It's also like not even the first time. I mean,
yeah.
I tend to think of Pasadena as the Palo Alto of the South. And you write in Exadelic, one part of it involves traveling to Jack Parsons' community, like the Caltech, early jet era, and that there were some interesting communities going on and interpersonal goings on at the time as well. So it's hardly the case that we've invented for the first time the notion of cults of brainy, smart people in a college town.
That's true, but the difference is that Parsons was eventually shouldered out of JPL, which he helped to found, and went into his weird cul-de-sac end of life thing. Whereas the rationalists became an extraordinarily influential community, and got, partly because their timing was good, and Yudkowsky saying that AI is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of the world and is going to be huge, was not a widely accepted view in the 2000s by almost anyone. There were some interesting tendrils of things happening in the valley and so forth. So when it did happen in 2012 is the usual date when Andrei Karpathy, Ilya Sutskever, and Jeffrey Hinton published an ImageNet paper about deep neural networks. And people were like, oh, this is very, very new. There was this community ready to sort of glom onto that and say, okay, we're ready to help, and get involved in any way that we can. And they were very successful. I mean, the sheer amount of money that has gone to what they consider the most important things is kind of mind-numbing.
It seems like this conveniently happened at the same time as cryptocurrencies, because would we be here with all of these well-funded, influential different centers were it not for crypto money?
I mean, there are ties between the origins of crypto and the origins of these communities. They're both involved with the Foresight Institute back in the 90s. And also, cryptocurrency ultimately derives. There's a wonderful book about this called The Politics of Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency, there's a very clear ideological train of thought that can be traced in its origins back to essentially libertarian and far-right conspiracy theories. And it's also, a subject of great interest to the extropians. So
I can remember mailing lists in the 90s for the cypherpunks where they were talking about the dream of secure, anonymous e-gold, basically, and it just took another 10 years or so for that actually to become a thing. I'm always interested in how money changes sort of the direction. You come to do good, you stay to do well of whatever project you might have.
Yeah.
And what really struck me both about your newsletter, about all these different origin groups all throughout your book, was that over and over again, it came to feel that a lot of the current AI safety research onto looking at X risk, what is the risk that all of humanity will survive, becoming AI singularity, blah, blah, blah. So much of it struck me as an excuse not to work on current, right now, literally happening to millions of people, real world problems affecting actual human lives, whether that's the kind of thing that I work on, which is mostly how our AI generated imagery harming people, like the current Grok scandal, or whether it's big problems like nuclear non-proliferation and climate change. And it seems like that, having this deflection from real world problems on the basis of kind of a unlikely, but just to hear it explained, it sounds very serious. Tiny percentage of saving untold future trillions of lives, et cetera, has motivated a lot of people to spend a lot of time on something that conveniently both lets them make a lot of money in the pursuit of that under the EA approach, and also allows certain other interests maybe to say, well, that means we don't need to work on climate change. We don't need to focus on current day inequality. It's okay, go into this explicitly, if a bunch of nations towards the center of the earth around the equator fall into the sea because rich Western lives are worth more than people in the Caribbean or in Africa. Literally, I forget who it was that said it, but this is very overt.
Yes.
And this plays into, you've mentioned both how a lot of these ideologies have very old antecedents in religion. You talk about how a lot of people are ex-evangelicals who are in some of these communities, but it seems like it also just plays into existing, continues to perpetuate long-standing misogynistic, racist, hegemonic and colonialist views of the world. And Jon, you write about this, I think, pretty cogently. It comes up a little differently maybe in Exadelic, but you still, I think, go into that as well. It's an opportunity, if you go back in time, to look at past injustices through the lens of a modern day software programmer. Is there a way to sort of break out of and hold up to the light some of these uglier antecedents and underpinnings for these movements? And is there anything to salvage from those ideas, or is it deflection all the way down?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, my book is an attempt to do that, right? I mean, once again, you're asking me to summarize large chunks of my book on stage, which I guess that's why we're friends. Is you torture me in public,
like a Rocco's Basilisk would do.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
it's not forever.
But yeah, I mean, this is part of the reality warping power of large concentrations of money, right? Like I say at the end of the book, the reason my book is polemical rather than just sort of a quirky tour is because these fringe ideas about discredited race science and the role of women in society and came along for the ride with weird views about AI that were not really supported by the facts, views about space travel, views about human biology, nanotechnology, and I think one of the themes that shows up over and over again in all of these different related subcultures, the rationalists, the incredibly infuriating affective accelerationists, and everybody in between, is a sort of contempt for understanding what has gone before.
Right.
Sometimes an overt, explicit contempt for history in particular. There have been people saying, like, we don't really care about history. History doesn't matter. Yudkowsky said that he could reinvent philosophy on the fly, and that, his misunderstanding of Bayesianism was more powerful than the scientific method. And I think when you are ignorant of history, there's an old saying about what happens to people who don't know about history, and what they're doomed to do. But these people believe that they are smart enough to just not have to worry about that, while also remaining sometimes proudly ignorant of many fields of human experience. And I think a lot of that comes from an idea that the world is significantly simpler than it actually is, right? If you believe that you individually are capable of being an expert in absolutely everything and know better than everyone, then you have to believe that the world is simpler than it is, because the world is so complicated you could never actually become an expert in everything. And so you end up believing both, that you are special in this way, and that you don't need to listen to experts. And you see this both in these communities and, of course, among the tech billionaires themselves. And so, of course, they end up grabbing onto ideas that have a racist and misogynist core to them, because there's lots of those ideas in our society, because our society has been for a very long time racist and misogynist and patriarchal and colonialist, and you name it. And if the reason why studying those things is valuable, in addition to just being valuable in and of itself, one of the reasons it's valuable to society is that's the way that we have, the best way we have of trying to combat those prejudices, right? But if you hold that kind of expertise in contempt, then of course you're just going to repeat the mistakes of the past, and proudly.
And it's a little ironic, I think, given how influenced by science fiction a lot of these folks are. And, Jon, you've written a lot of books that are either sort of current day, almost science fiction-y, or like near-term science fiction, or more overtly science with the latest book. And I would see like your long career, coming from a STEM background, working primarily in tech, and then, writing novels on the side as like a repudiation of this idea that like STEM is all that anybody needs to know, and especially as a way of using science fiction to explore both like potential like futures or alternative presents, as well as delving into like history and imagining alternate potential. Can you talk about maybe a little bit how do you break out as somebody who could easily have been like one of these guys into like actually valuing like history, the arts, talking about ancient Gnostics, learning a lot about squirrels for the squirrel book, which is great, by the way. It's called Beasts of New York. If you want to read a book about squirrels, it's the most interesting book about squirrels you'll read this year. Anyway, I digress. How do you work to integrate like the arts and like liberal humanities into your career?
I'm not sure it's so much an integration of the arts thing. I think actually there is a great hunger for optimistic science fiction in the tech industry. I hear that a lot. People are fairly disappointed that I guess you could describe Exadelic as optimistic. You'd really be stretching in some ways. But I think, I think that's part of it. Obviously, if you focus more on the tech side of things, you have less time. But actually, a lot of the people I know in the tech world, including quite senior people, are sort of widely read and culturally interesting. I think a more complex and difficult issue to deal with is the fact that the way one succeeds in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley is by rejecting expertise, is by making a very confident bet on a thing that seems to have very low odds of success, and all the experts tell you is wrong and is never going to work. And this is the mindset that gets you to winning. pessimists sound smart, optimists make money is sort of a truism quote in the Valley. And so that kind of pathological optimism, I think, is a big factor of, the resulting culture that you see. I also have a more optimistic take on the communities. I actually went to Effective Altruism Global last year in Oakland, feeling a little bit like a double agent. And they do talk about nuclear risk and biorisk and climate risk, but it's mostly like AI still gets all the attention. But I did get the admittedly very subjective sense that the era of sort of extreme effective altruism, extreme long-termism, extreme rejection of other ideas is kind of viewed as this awkward adolescent phase they don't like to talk about so much anymore. I'm not saying that they have, achieved perfect enlightenment. It's kind of like anything does, as it becomes larger and grows in a, more diverse set of people, it becomes sort of a watered down version of itself. I have a screenshot in my phone somewhere of two competing talks, one saying, doing impactful research that still had 300 open seats, and one that was effectively how to get an AI safety policy job that was sold out in standing room only, which, it's kind of a networking event now, which is, probably better given for better or worse. And I think, you can find a lot of post-rationalists in the Bay Area. I think you might struggle to find that many outright rationalists these days. There has been a moving on from that, which I think is good.
They're there.
Less loud than they used to be. I mean, I tend to agree with you that just over the last few years, I've noticed a softening and focus on AI safety and X risk as like the more pressing things to worry about, and worry more about non-consensual deepfake nudes, about political deepfakes, et cetera. And so I wonder whether this is at least in some part responsive to not necessarily getting a lot of traction from regulators on that.
I think it was the fall of FTX.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I think it was the fallout of FTX, and I am not convinced that it's in good faith.
Another proud member of the Stanford community. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, I'm no fan of the post-rationalists either, but that's a separate conversation.
So, I mean, you both just touched on something, though, that I think is interesting in light of, like, we hear a lot from like AI boosters, like this is going to save everything, it's going to solve all of our problems for us. We're just going to treat it as, I think you referred to it as AGI as a genie granting 3 wishes, that they sort of like solve climate change, and, like solve death for us, etc. And we'll listen to what it will do. And then the flip side is like the AI doomerism, like this is going to lead to the downfall of humanity. This is going to displace jobs. This is going to all of the water, etc. And that both of them are in some sense 2 sides of the same coin, which may be granting AI greater powers for good or for ill than it really has.
Yeah.
And I think what I hear sort of lurking in here is that maybe we're in an era where even some of the proponents of some of the stronger forms of EAC, of AI, et cetera, are gesturing in the direction of like AI as a normal technology. And for all that I am soaking in like AI haterade in like the communities where I spend a lot of time, I think there are a lot of some voices, and I think you're one of them, Jon, who talk a lot about being realistic about what AI can do and cannot do. And I'm curious whether like you see us maybe just in the near term getting to a place where we have a better sense of what AI is actually really, really good at. Your software program, I know, can be really helpful for that. And then figuring out both what is not good at and like what should we turn away from, going back to like, you follow the money, we follow like where investment trends will go. And will that dictate to us like the 2 poles of like, on the one hand, you might say something like, this is the worst that the tech will ever be. We hear that a lot. But then I think what I hear you saying, and this is throughout the book, is that doesn't mean that there's no limits to what it can do in either direction. So I'm curious whether you guys think that we may be plotting out a more like even keel middle path through hype and into a more realistic stance this year in the near term.
I'll cede mostly the first answer, Adam, but I do want to say that if you really believed AGI was around the corner, your big announcement of January would probably not be that you're now showing ads on your website. I mean, I think there's a dramatic inconsistency here.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I hope we get to a place where we're more clear on what it can and can't do. I tend to view all of this through a historical lens. And so I tend to think in terms of AI booms and AI winters. And so I think what's likely to happen is the same thing that we've seen in other AI booms, in that eventually we sort of reach a limit. The promises that people were making of AGI just sort of obviously don't come to fruition. And then we live with this technology as it is long enough that we know what it can and can't do, in the same way that we know what, say, other machine learning algorithms can and can't do, in a pretty good sense, right? Like, nobody thinks that the Netflix recommendation engine is going to become sentient and take over the world. But also the Netflix recommendation engine is not bad, right? It's pretty good at recommending movies. We know that it is. I have many problems with the way that generative AI in general, and LLMs in particular, are created and trained and deployed. But putting all of that aside for a moment, there are certainly things that generative AI and LLMs are good at, that they can do well, or well enough. But, do I think we have a good sense of what all of those things are? Probably not yet, just because it hasn't been long enough. Do I think we should be deploying the technology as widely as we are? No, but that's due to all of the harms, both in the creation of the technology and that we see in how it is out in the world. But yeah, I mean, I think that what's the alternative to figuring out, to having the hype bubble end? The only way the hype bubble doesn't end is if AGI actually shows up. The question is, when do people come to their senses? I mean, predicting that is like predicting when a stock market bubble will pop. I think we are seeing stock market bubble. I don't know when it's going to pop. If I knew when it was going to pop, I would probably have a lot more money than I do.
There's a line in Michael Chabon's book, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, that says, a messiah who actually arrives is of no use to anybody.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. No. That's exactly. I mean, when I was writing a similar thought in my book, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Right. It's the promise of the near future apocalypse or rapture that is of the most use to all of these people. There's a picture in The Singularity is Near by Kurzweil, one of the seminal texts in this whole area, of Kurzweil literally wearing one of those cardboard things that sandwich boards. Yes, exactly. That's what I was looking for. He's wearing a sandwich board saying the singularity is near. I'm like, okay, at least you know what you sound like. And did he give me permission to use that image in my book? No, he didn't. But whatever.
Now we know it's up there.
Exactly. Yeah. It's important. I mean, he's got a sense of humor about it. He still is completely serious and thinks the singularity is near. And I cannot believe that he set up a punchline for me this well. But when I give talks about this, it's just so easy to point out, okay, he wrote a book in 2005 called The Singularity is Near, and then in 2024, he wrote a sequel called The Singularity is Nearer, which, why would you do that? But okay. But yeah, I mean, the connections to religious movements of the past, thousands of years, this is, in many ways, just another one of them. And one of the things that proponents of these movements, especially Yudkowsky, will say is, well, you can't figure out what's true just by pointing out that we're cult-shaped or religion-shaped. I'm like, no. I'm not saying that Yudkowsky and the rationalists and Kurzweil and all the rest are wrong because they look like a religion or a cult. I'm saying they're wrong and they look like a religion. So
Sometimes
Yeah.
disastrously so.
Yeah, exactly.
Going back to FTX, like how did a bunch of long-termists miss the thing that was right in front of their faces is something that's never been answered to myself.
These are hard, especially about the future.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know, John, that you hate trying to predict the future, but you also like you have a track record among your many things you've done. You founded a few companies or been early on in a few companies, including AI-related companies. Does that inform where you think maybe we may be going with the AI bubble in terms of, capital can lie to you, but it can't lie to itself? Like, are we going to see more normalization of where investments are going, what kinds of companies are founded? Are we going to focus on just slinging ads yet again as we come out maybe through a hazier period?
Yeah, it's my turn to say I don't disagree with anything I've just said. So literally yesterday, I texted a friend recommending them the Yiddish Policemen's Union. They should go read it. And a month earlier, I texted the same friend saying, look, I promise I'm not an AI boomer, but wow, these things are a lot better than they were a year ago, like a lot better. There has been, particularly in software, a remarkable phase change over the last 2 months, I would say, where more and more people who were sort of previously staunchly anti-AI, like the creator of Rails, the creator of Linux, Linus Torvalds, famously a jerk, but a smart jerk, the Italian socialist creator of Redis. Yesterday, it was the creator of Node.js, Moxie Merlinspike, the anarchist creator of Signal. I have all the last couple of months come out and said, okay, the era of writing software by hand is pretty much over. We had a good run, but whoa, things are different now. The field has changed forever because of LLMs, and I'm inclined to agree. Hence my text to my friend a month ago. Like there has been a dramatic improvement in their ability to write code alone. That's one small thing that they do, but the world spends $1 trillion a year on software conservatively. If you can make that 30% more efficient, value is not cash flow, but that is in principle $300 billion a year of value you're generating. Suddenly, this makes the expenses that are being poured into data centers make at least a little bit more sense.
They're still not going to be in space.
I'm prepared to concede that point.
Anyways, please continue.
I think we are in a bubble, because we always are in a bubble when things like this happened, the dot-com bubble. But this bubble is a little different in that you have these very, very deep-pocketed entities who are also part of it, your Amazons, your Googles, your Microsofts. And some of them have been pretty explicit about saying, yeah, we probably are in a bubble. And when it pops, there'll be all this talent and all this infrastructure and all these GPUs that we'll be able to buy for cheap. Isn't that great? So
well, they happen to have some other business that is not just an AI business,
right? Because Microsoft and Google and Amazon are basically infinite money fountains, which it's handy to have those in business. So,
well, I look forward to scooping up some cheap Aeron shares. We all got to do like 25 years ago.
Copper wiring, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that leads, probably what's looming over the minds of a lot of the students that may be here today. Like, look, we're here, we're at Stanford. We're in the belly of what birthed a lot of the modern Silicon Valley, and unlocked trillions of dollars of economic productivity. But that now we have folks who may be less likely than they were a few years ago to get sidetracked into very earnestly working on AI safety threats that will never happen. I'm sensitive to you've written before about how many white papers come out of organizations like MIRI that nobody ever necessarily reads. But now the more pressing issue might be are you going to have a job when you graduate? So I guess in near term, words of advice for young people, basically, what should people going into the job market today, a lot of whom are sitting right here, what should they be, how should they be incorporating AI into their lives, and how should they be thinking about this, maybe we're coming out of a bubble moment?
I have a take on this. Learn how to do whatever it is that you want to do without AI. Not because AI can't help with whatever it is that you want to do. Maybe it can. But because the job pool of people who know how to do that job without AI will shrink. And if you learn how to do it without AI, you will have skills that will be helpful whether or not you use AI. And those skills will become increasingly rare and increasingly valuable.
I would broadly agree with that. My sort of one-liner on what to do with AI today is that, infuriatingly, modern AI is a tool that usually masquerades as a solution. And people try to use it as a solution and go, well, that went terribly, terribly wrong. But if you bear that in mind, if you kind of see through the masquerade and use it as a tool, then it's a general purpose tool, which is by and large useful. And my sort of specific thing to focus on take is maybe idiosyncratic and technical, but so originally these things were next token predictors, right? Everyone knows, it takes a text and it predicts the next token of the text. And then we worked out how to teach them not just to produce next tokens, but to produce the next token in chains of reasoning about the next tokens that they are about to predict. And then we worked out how to get them to produce the next token in sort of orchestration of various chains of reasoning of the next tokens, like climbing up one level of abstraction roughly every year here. And as you climb the abstraction levels, it's harder and harder to sort of understand what the side effects are and what the consequences are and how these things behave. And if you try to push them into one thing, they'll probably go another. And the analogy that comes to mind for me is the early days of the internet, where there's all this possibilities out there and people were throwing all this weird and random stuff up there. And it was horrifically insecure and everything was transmitted in plain text and no one was quite sure, what was a good idea and what was not. And this is probably a personal preference, but some sort of not AI safety, but AI security, I prophesy will be a booming field for the next 10 years.
Study cybersecurity. Can't go wrong. We can't go wrong with that. And I guess just to close, one of the things that is not in your book, that is in a lot of books, is and what do we do about this, social problem?
A little bit.
Just a little bit. Your one recommendation is every billionaire is a policy failure.
Yeah.
So we should tax the billionaire. So I wanted to just get real hot take stuff on your thoughts on the proposed billionaire tax that California is potentially going to have on the ballot.
I mean, I don't know that much about it, but what I do know about it seems like a good start. It's not enough. I would like to see a cap on wealth. With, like a wealth tax that has a 100% marginal bracket above a certain amount, like, I don't know, in the book I suggest $500 million. Seems like that should be enough money for anybody. You spend, I worked this out in the book, it's something like you spend $1,000 a day for 100 years and you'll still have $300 million left over, or something like that. But, I think we got to get rid of international tax havens and whatnot. We got to have, a real progressive tax that makes sense. We got to have a state tax. I think taxes are great and we should have more of them. I also think Donald Trump should be in jail. But you don't get everything you want. Yeah, exactly. But no, I think we have to break the power of the ultra wealthy. And someone famous who I won't name recently said to me, "Oh, you don't really mean it. You don't really mean that, you want to get rid of billionaires. You want to get rid of their power." I'm like, how do you get rid of their power without getting rid of their money? It's the same thing. So, I perhaps this is me being an old man who is naive about the way the world works, but I think that representative democracy is a good thing. And I also think that we can't keep having it if we allow massive unjust concentrations of wealth. And I do think that those concentrations of wealth are invariably unjust because nobody does anything alone. No person does anything alone. No company does anything alone. No country does anything alone. So, we have to learn to quote Lyndon Johnson, we must love one another or die. So I think we have to find a way to do that. And I think allowing billionaires to exist is not only bad for society, but bad for the billionaires themselves. And I also think history shows that taxation is the compromise. That in the long run, one of two things is going to happen. Either we're going to tax them and find a way to have a more just distribution of wealth, or eventually they're going to get dragged out of their homes and killed. And so I think I'm in favor of not eating the rich. I would rather tax the rich. Because I think ultimately those are the two choices. Maybe there's a third one, which is we let them run everything and we all die because of ecological collapse. But let's not do that one either. But yeah, in terms of broader prescriptions beyond that, I don't know. I think that's the kind of thing that has to be worked out in community. I am not someone who knows all of the answers.
What you say shouldn't go.
Aside from the taxing the wealthy part, exactly, but also that's not my idea. That's not a new idea.
Jon, you're a serial entrepreneur who hails from the land to the north that gave us both not us, but like social safety nets and like the ImageNet paper. Like, what are your thoughts on like, can we have like a prosperous, incentivized, to continue innovating future that is still consonant with the sorts of ideas of community governance, taxation, et cetera?
So broadly, we as in the globe, yes. Hypothetically, we, yes. But we as in the United States of America, I don't know, that's more complicated. I've been writing I think I read a piece about this 10 years ago, that like I understand the vitriol aimed at Silicon Valley and tech wealth and so forth. But I do think that most of it is actually because Washington, D.C. has abdicated its responsibility for quite some time now. There is such a thing as well-regulated capitalism. None of it's perfect, but like the Scandinavian countries and Canada and New Zealand and various other countries do show like a generally more equitable, prosperous way that works for everyone. The sort of staunch right-wing Americans will say it's impossible to have dynamism and inventivism in such a system. I think that's complete nonsense. But the reason it hasn't happened in America is because regulation is essentially impossible here, because the two political parties, there are only two of them, which Americans will also say is the only possible way thing, which is also nonsense. And they're so polarized that they can't get anything done. And passing like meaningful regulatory systems or meaningful safety nets or, meaningful universal health care, as shown by the last 20 years, is essentially impossible here under the circumstances. So until the political circumstances change, I think everything else is going to be, trying to address symptoms, not the fundamental problem. I realize that's not a very optimistic take. The optimistic take is that in principle, this is possible, and hopefully, there will be some sort of come to Jesus moment where America realizes that in fact the status quo is not sort of viable, and the constant warring and sparring, is nobody is winning from. In a few years, maybe we'll see.
Great. Well, I want to transition it to Q&A. We have Annie's going to be both grabbing maybe some cues off of the Zoom, and we'll be doing a mic run to anybody who has a question. I think we had one, right up here up front.
Thank you very much. It's an amazing talk. So I have a question. So, for example, like sometimes people seek advice to the chatbots, for question, like when they feel frustrated or have emotions. Like the AI would probably read text that feels like they are showing empathy that they may not really understand. Like for example, maybe challenging talk or frustration at work, and they probably gonna help you do a really nice diagnostic, help you kind of separate the emotions with a really clear a to-do, etc. But in that sense, although we feel like the decision making is in human hand, but actually they're probably gonna impact you how you communicate with people and react to the external world in a very subtle and implicit way. So this is maybe not a very clear question, but more I would like to hear your opinion. How would you think about these kind of things in terms of trust and safety with AI and also humanity with AI? Thank you.
No, it's a good question. I always think about Eliza. Are you familiar with Eliza? Yeah. Okay. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about when I say Eliza. Okay. So there's enough people who don't know. I'm going to explain. Eliza is one of the first, maybe the first chatbot, I think, from the 1960s. And it's 100 lines of code. Nobody thinks that Eliza is thinking. Eliza was using a sort of trick that, you can get something to pass the Turing test if you're simulating a particular kind of human in a particular role. The easiest human, as I think Douglas Hofstadter once pointed out, to simulate is someone who's comatose or asleep. But the person who put together Eliza, whose name is escaping me, Weisenbaum, that's right, yeah. He realized that you could simulate a particular kind of therapist who just sort of mirrors back to you what you said without too much trouble. And so you'd go in and say to Eliza, I'm not feeling well today. And Eliza would say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why are you not feeling well today? Oh, I got in a fight with my partner. I'm sorry to hear that. Why did you get in a fight with your partner? You know, a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. There were people, a lot of people, who spoke with Eliza, who said that Eliza really understood that and really understood what was going on in their lives. And, you know, there was something there that was really helping them. And like, not Eliza's a tool that helped me, but Eliza is a being that understands me. And I really think that this is a manifestation of a well-known cognitive bias called pareidolia, which is the tendency to see patterns, especially human-like patterns, in places where they don't exist. In my book, I give the example of the face on Mars, which was a low-resolution picture taken by the Viking orbiters that looked like a human face, and then when we got a high-resolution image of it later on, it was just a jumble of rocks. It's not a face. I think that, yes, LLMs are capable of many impressive tricks, but they don't understand what's going on with us. And I think that it is a lot of them sort of mirroring back what we're throwing in, right? And this is not an original idea. There's, the idea of AI as a mirror. And I think that this is what leads to these sorts of AI cases of like AI-induced psychosis that we've been seeing. Is like, if you get someone sort of trapped in that kind of feedback loop with themselves where they think it's coming from outside of themselves, but it's not, that can take people into a pretty dark place. So I think, maybe unsurprisingly, given the other stuff I've said, I think this is an area ripe for regulation. To bust out one more thing from 20th century history, anybody remember the Tylenol murders? Yeah. So once upon a time, in I think the late 70s, early 80s, some random psychopath put poison to a few bottles of Tylenol, I think in the Chicago area, and a few people died, including a kid. And as a result, the manufacturer of Tylenol and basically every other over-the-counter drug introduced safety seals into their drugs to prevent that from happening again. Nobody blamed the companies for this happening. It clearly wasn't their fault. Nobody anticipated that somebody would be this sick to do this. But that happened, and then there was government regulation to make sure that companies did that. This was the public response after a few deaths. There have been more deaths and more deaths of children from AI. Why are we allowing this to go on? Why aren't we clamoring for government intervention? I think that says something about the power of the PR campaign that's been waged by the big tech companies and the AI companies in particular to prevent us from seeing this as a problem amenable to regulation, when I think it manifestly is.
Adam, you mentioned you would recommend a cap of $500 million on wealth.
Sure. I mean, I kind of just picked that number because it seemed easily defensible.
Sure. What if somebody's solving a world problem that requires more than $500 million? One. Number two, is it fair to punish everybody for the majority's wrongdoing?
I think that then there could be more than one person doing that and they could pool their wealth. I don't think. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could get a government involved. You could start a nonprofit and get, donations or something. I mean, I don't think that there's anyone alive ever now or in the history or in the future. I don't think that any single human is actually capable of effectively deploying that much money single-handedly without anyone else being involved.
We have a question up front.
So I wanted to ask a question, Adam, to you on that. You do touch a little bit on some things that can be done. And so what I wanted, you even just brought it up right now as well in front of us here. But I also feel like it's a tragedy of the commons. It's like another example of that. And are we really going to have a Leviathan or some coordination to really enforce that? And you also, sorry, you also talk about that there can be defections and it'll be hard to control, and it's like squeezing a balloon. But I did want to ask you, do you think there is something in the current zeitgeist or right now that really could be actionable, even though we have this political paralysis, even though we have the great power race between China and the US, and these companies are going as fast as they can and they're getting the capital to go ahead and do it? Is there something even small that would be kind of a baby step that really would be enforceable, would be something that could be implemented? Because right now I just feel like there's just a lot of collective frustration. There's a lot of ideas, but really nothing is going to happen. Nothing will happen. And the other thing that could be is that it would take a disaster. It would take like a Great Depression-like thing. It would take like a nuclear blast to go off before someone would actually take any action. So we would just have to wait for that horrible thing to unfold. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, is there something we can do as a baby step before the horrible thing happens to us?
There is an unfortunate history of disaster-driven policy.
It's a good question. I don't know is the short answer. I do think that, I know more about the US than elsewhere in the world because this is where I live, this is where I'm from. But given the situation in the US, certainly it's not reasonable to expect anything good to come out of the government right now. And even if the midterms go well, I still don't see, really good policy coming at the federal level until at least, 2029. But maybe the states will do something. The two things that come to mind to me first, though, as answers to your question are, I really think that there's an overwhelming public consensus that child pornography is bad. And I think that could be a really good place to try to introduce the idea that, hey, regulating the tech industry with a heavier hand is possible and good. Like you could pass a law in a state that says an AI model that produces CSAM is illegal. And so if your model can do that, you have to not have it on the market in this country or this state or whatever. The other thing that comes to mind is just, organizing of a kind that doesn't have to involve government action, right? I mean, obviously, we should be organizing to try to shift the political situation in the US, but there's also labor organizing. And I think that the tech industry is really ripe for unionization because one of the things that people keep pointing to, and I keep seeing articles about this, is, the leaders of Silicon Valley have shown their true colors and, they've all defected and moved to Trump. And, what happened to Silicon Valley? And then other people say, but, the rank and file workers at the big tech companies, they all hate Trump. I'm like, okay, I don't think that the billionaires were ever as solidly, pro-democracy as we wanted to think they are. I think that Mark Andreessen believes the story that he tells about why he, changed camps, but I don't actually think that's the real story. I think that he is deluding himself and that he was never actually that committed to democracy and like liberal politics as he says he was. But when you have a situation where the leaders of a company are doing something where most of the workers of that company hate that they're doing that thing, that's an opportunity to organize and start a union and try to exert pressure on the leaders of those companies. That's something that you can do even with the horrible political situation in this country, right? So I realize that this is maybe not the most popular position to hold, especially in this particular location, but I think that more tech workers should unionize.
The graduate student union folks would probably agree with that. And that's actually a big takeaway from another book, The AI Con by Emily Bender, And Alex Hanna, that also came out recently, is focusing on the labor aspect of all this. John, I'm curious if you have any
Yes.
one weird trick, or at least small inventions
So,
that would get
I mean,
involved.
riffing on what Adam just said, speaking as a card-carrying tech worker person, we are historically there has been clamor for unionization of tech in the 20-teens. Google at least was talking about it, or at least there was an organization at Google talking about it, and it kind of fell by the wayside. And at that time, tech workers were kind of seen as the only check on the balance of tech power because they could go wherever they wanted and work where they wanted, you know. And since then, we're in a different but quite interesting state. What I was just saying about software as we understand it moving into an entirely different world now. Most of the tech workers, you know, who previously thought of themselves as untouchable, able to go from one 6 or 7 figure job to another with ease, you know, masters of the software universe, are looking at what's going on with a combination of like fascination and horror at, you know, the thing that has made them special and made their lives very easy for the last 20 years is kind of, you know, dwindling like quicksand beneath, or like sand in an hourglass between their fingers. And so there may be an opportunity to sort of take this weird moment and the sort of weird sense of vulnerability that they feel, and I include myself in that, like it's a very weird time to be in software, and, you know, turn that into some sort of collective action in a way that was not possible before.
We've got time maybe for one final one in the room, or maybe if there's one on the Zoom that we should share. Either way. Okay, great.
Thank you so much. I think kind of twisting that last sort of question, something you said really resonated me of simplification kind of being this harm of like, if you think you're so smart, you just kind of abstract away from everything else. I guess I'm hearing these narratives and the stories you're telling, and I agree. And I kind of want to challenge you both of something that throughout your book that changed your mind, or something you're thinking about that maybe you haven't quite figured out, right? Because I hear the narratives and they're wonderful. I just want to see like, what is something you're thinking about or something you haven't quite resolved in this moment? Does that kind of make sense? Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Let's start with John this time.
Oh, I'm not sure I have one. If you have one, go ahead. Like
I have a really short.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. Like I just gave these you know, possible, you know, smaller policy interventions, smaller in a relative sense. And I do think that taxing billionaires out of existence is a good idea. But I also think if we did all of those things, that probably wouldn't really be enough. I think, like, you know, when I was writing the book, originally I had thought that I would have to end it with a positive vision of what a good future would look like. And I kept trying to do that, and I kept failing. And eventually I came across a George Orwell quote that I used as a get out of jail free card. Because, you know, if you, I think it was Somerset Maugham who said the ability to quote is a serviceable substitute for wit. And, you know, quoting someone a lot smarter and more famous than you are always a good idea. But yeah, Orwell said, you know, basically that that utopias are not really something that we're good at building or thinking about clearly. And that most people who try to come up with utopias fail. And so instead we should think about directions we want to move in. And I think that's right. And I stand by what I've said about what directions we should move in, but like, that's not the whole story. You know, I don't know what, and I also don't know how to get from here to there. I have some ideas, but I don't know which ones are right. You know, and that's very scary. And as a writer, and to be slightly pretentious, as an artist, when I have that feeling, that is usually a good thing, because it means if I run toward it, something interesting might happen, and I might get some good work out of it. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And yeah, I guess that's my answer. Yeah.
As you've been
Yes.
in AI, have you changed your mind about? Is there anything that you?
I mean, there's one I'm figuring back and forth. Like, I'm fundamentally fairly optimistic that we will understand that, as I said, AI is a tool that masquerades a solution, and we'll look past the sort of attempt to fool us with solutions and start using it as a tool in sort of a generally, you know, useful way, depending on who's using it, of course. But I wonder about that sometimes. You know, there is the thing I'm not sure about is, you know, I occasionally these days I go on Facebook and I see people who have just written their personal posts, like just stuff that is going on in their lives, and it has that sheen of LLM generated text. And I'm like, maybe we're not going to look past this solution. Maybe we're not going to start using it as a tool. This worries me somewhat.
Hold on a sec. I have a question for you. Do you get those AI generated bookmarks?
Oh, all the time. Yes.
They are just like, they make me want to vomit.
So maybe we'll get out of this and we'll use science fiction and carefully digging into history to get there. Please join me in thanking my guests, Adam and Jon, for a really fascinating discussion.